you a reflexive notion of music. Hello, Harry. We are welcome. We are very pleased to have you here on Contrast Festival in Lviv. Unfortunately, this year virtually. Hope that next year it will change a lot. And today, your third lecture dedicated a reflexive notion of music. So thank you very much for being here, at least virtually, and please we can start your lecture now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction, and good afternoon to everybody. Today at my third lecture at the Contemporary Music Festival Contrasts in Lviv, I would like to present to you a model how the idea of new music has changed due to the digital revolution of music. And the thesis is, as the title suggests, the concept or the notion of art music has become reflexive. The two previous lectures on Trond Reinholdsen's opera and on conceptual art and music will fit into this model. In 2012, I published the book, The Digital Revolution of Music, Music Philosophy. And in my opinion, music philosophy is not really an academic discipline. Philosophical thinking about music is only needed in those rare historical moments when the entire musical culture is undergoing a serious change, and as a result, it becomes necessary to rethink the whole concept and the whole notion of art music. My thesis, which I had presented in 2008 in a thought experiment, was that exactly this is the case at the beginning of the 21st century, because a change from a literary to a digital music culture is taking place. Many of the arguments in the book were hypothetical 8 years ago and have now become almost self-evident. Above all, there are many new works in new music in which this change toward digital music culture manifests itself. And accordingly, it is much easier to say today in what sense the notion of music has changed. If one understands music philosophy in this sense, it has three different problems to solve. First, it must reconstruct the old paradigm that has been valid up to now. Let us call it paradigm one. And secondly, music philosophy has to describe the transformation mechanism that leads to the present paradigm shift, which is today triggered by the digital revolution. And thirdly, music philosophy is faced with the task of designing the following paradigm two, being created. So what does it mean to reconstruct a paradigm? And more specifically, a paradigm of art music. In principle, it is a matter of analyzing the grammar of the hegemonic self-description in the new music system. The task has a descriptive and it has a normative aspect. On the one hand, one has to clarify the question, what is music? This is about what belongs to the sphere of art music and who has access to it and to the resources and who does not. On the other hand, one has to reconstruct the normative question, what is good music or what is excellent or outstanding music? Culture is always a competitive field in which decisions have to be made about distribution of resources, about performances, about grants and prizes. Both the descriptive and the normative questions are more or less pre-decided in a musical culture and belong to the grammar and to the self-description of art music in a given time. So let us start with the descriptive question. What was the historical notion of new music? New music was constituted at the beginning of the 20th century, and its most important distinguishing feature was at that time atonality. It is through the difference between tonal and atonal music that new music can constitute itself in contrast to classical music. This suspension of the tonal system by new music has strong implications. One immediate consequence is that new music is distinguished from popular music, which is anchored in the tonal system and follows a beat. The distinction between serious music and popular music is thus a direct consequence of the abstract negation of classical music, which follows the principle of tonality and accordingly has melody, rhythm, and harmony. A third boundary is formed by new music to the other arts when it began to develop at the beginning of the 20th century. Like classical music, new music was absolute music. In other words, pure instrumental music defined what music is by its very nature. New music thus took over the self-description of classical music, which essentially followed Eduard Hanslick. In 1854, Hanslick had written in his book, "On the musically beautiful, tonally moving forms are the sole content and object of music." In exactly this sense, also new music originally understood itself as pure instrumental music, which could be fully described by inner musical parameters such as pitch, rhythm, harmony, and timbre. New music has never been a direct representation of the world and could not simply reflect live world experiences. It was rather assumed that the structure of pure instrumental music reflected the structure of the universe. It was assumed that there was a structural analogy between music and world. The term new music was originally defined by 4 boundaries: a demarcation from classical music, popular music, the other arts, and the live world. The question is, of course, why there are just 4 and not 3 or 5 constitutive boundaries. The decisive factor for the selection here, however, is that one uses those distinctions that have already played a role in the new music discourse or in the art discourse in general. And here I would argue that all other conceivable boundaries can be traced back to one of those boundaries in one way or another. With this, we can answer the first descriptive question about the paradigm of new music. New music was originally absolute music. Hanslick's idea of absolute music reminded the hegemonic self-description of both classical music in the 19th century and new music in the 20th century. Of course, there were also always counter movements, such as program music, but these always remained a kind of secondary idea in the self-description of art music. The next question is, which normative guiding idea belonged to the paradigm of new music? The short answer is newness. The modern arts have developed through a negation of the central idea of classical art, namely through a negation of the idea of beauty that has been valid in the arts for centuries. Even today, old art academies carry the classical idea of beauty in their name. Literally translated, the Academy of Arts in Munich is called Academy of Beautiful Arts. However, modern art no longer wants to be beautiful, but above all, it wants to be new, which is reflected in the name of new music. New music was new above all because of it used new compositional techniques to create new music experiences. In this respect, new music in the 20th century followed a material aesthetic, whose normative idea was to permanently create new aesthetical material. With Adorno, one can say that new music followed the ideal of so-called material progress. The paradigm of new music in the 20th century is thus composed of a descriptive and of a normative guiding idea. It was in its self-understanding as absolute music and followed the normative ideal of material aesthetics or material progress. For a long time, the idea of material aesthetics was a source of innovation. But as early as the 1970s, the end of material progress was reached. The last new isms such as musique concrète, instrumental, spectralism, minimalism were all developed almost half a century ago. Since the 1990s, the dilemma of innovation has become evident, as even Helmut Lachenmann noted in an essay at that time. The idea of material aesthetics has since lost its persuasive power in new music and, as here in the model, began to fade. Since the first signs of exhaustion of material progress, it took another 4 decades until the digital revolution created a real chance to get out of this innovation dead end. In Germany, digitization in new music became a topic of discussion around 2008. This year, I presented a thought experiment on this topic at the Darmstadt Spring Conference. The decisive factor was that YouTube had been around since 2005, and composers were beginning to discover the platform for themselves. From this time of 2008, 2009, for example, Johannes Kreitel created charts music, Peter Ablinger, the talking piano, and Trond Reinhardsen, the complete music performance videos. These are conceptual music pieces produced only for YouTube and can only reach a wider audience via YouTube. The music video became a new storage and distribution medium for new music. Conceptual music is in stark contrast to the idea of absolute music. It is the complete opposite of pure instrumental music. Sometimes musical instruments are also deliberately destroyed. For this reason, conceptual music had no role in new music and was largely ignored and systematically excluded in the 20th centuries from the new music system. However, the digital revolution is not only a technological, but also a social revolution and sets everything in motion, both in terms of the production, distribution, and reception of music. An important aspect, among many others, is that digitalization also changes the structure of institutions. In principle, the digitization of new music also leads to a deinstitutionalization of the new music system. Thus, it was only the dissemination of conceptual music via YouTube that led to the subsequent inclusion of conceptual music in art music. Music institutions create the prerequisites for the emergence of such a sophisticated cultural achievement as new music is. The first most important institutional pillars of the new music system were in the 20th century, first, the academy. This refers to all institutions where music is taught. The knowledge of notation, playing techniques, compositional techniques was, at least until recently, a kind of secret knowledge that could only be acquired within and not outside these institutions. A second institutional pillar is formed by the ensembles which perform art music. Music does not really exist if it exists only as a score. Thirdly, one of the most important music institutions was the publishing house that printed music scores. Fourthly, an essential institutional pillar in countries like Germany is the public broadcasting corporation, through which new music distributed, promoted, and financially supported. One could mention here a whole range of other music institutions, such as music criticism or collecting society like GEMA, or music foundations like the Siemens Foundation and the Siemens Prize. But ultimately, these 5 institutional pillars have supported the new music system in the 20th century. Accordingly, the next question is how digitization is changing the new music system today. And in keeping with our festival theme, metamorphosis, one could also ask what kind of metamorphosis new music is experiencing in the wake of the digital revolution. And the basic idea is that the digitization creates bypasses, byways, and detours to musical institutions. Today, technological alternatives to musical institutions are available everywhere. Instead of music publishers, one can produce one's own sheet music with notation programs, such as Finale. Composers whose music is not broadcasted on public radio can at least share their music on YouTube. You can write about music not only in music magazines, but also on websites and blogs. And besides recordings with a real ensemble, there is now also the possibility to record a score with virtual orchestras. And finally, you can experience new music not exclusively live at the music festival, but today there are also online streaming and internet concerts. At first glance, these technological alternatives all seem like second choice for losers, but they will change the whole music culture and redefine who the winner and the losers are. Due to these technological bypasses, a gradual deinstitutionalization of the new music system is taking place. The strongly institutionalized new music system has been able to strictly regulate access to art music because the institutions have been able to perform a gatekeeper function. And those who were not allowed through one door could not pass through the other doors. Without studying music at a music academy, a composer could not find a publisher. Without a publisher, he could not get commissions. Without commissions, there was no performance of the written score. And without performances, one was not really a composer at all. Here you can see some aspects of progressive deinstitutionalization of art music. At first, there is a loss of control over the inclusion and exclusion of musicians and composers in the new music scene. Composers can come from other music genres and other art scenes much more than before. There's also a general democratization of music because the moment art music becomes more accessible, it also loses its previous elite status. The cultural economy is also changing. An economy of scarcity is becoming an economy of abundance, where there is an abundance of composers, compositions, and performances. Of course, under these conditions, one must also reckon with more dilettantism, but there's also a gain of autonomy for composers. The previous culture of commissions is being replaced by a culture of offers. That is important. Most works will be created without commissions, mainly because there are alternative recording possibilities. One consequence of this is that music institutions can no longer define what art music is when they award commissions and performances to composers. The character of composer careers is also changing. In a strongly institutional art system, they are slow and sustained, whereas in a weakly institutionalized art scene, careers take off very quickly, but they also come to an end at the next moment. Moreover, precarization is now growing, resulting in a loss of social security for participants. How do these deinstitutionalization processes affect the music itself? The central thesis is that there is a gradual transgression of the historical genres and notions of new music, whereby transgression here means dissolution of boundaries or the crossing of existing boundaries of the new music system. The transgression of new music takes place in relation to the four boundaries that we have pre-constructed as the constitutive boundaries of new music at the beginning of the 20th century. There is thus a transgression in relation to the other arts, to the live world, to popular music, and to classical music. The computer is a universal interface to connect and combine music with pictures, movies, texts, diagrams, everyday sounds, popular music, and much more. But this creates a complete different type of art music. New music is no longer absolute music, but that would be my suggestion, it becomes relational music. Relational music crosses the border to the other arts, and with it, a constitutive border of the historical notion of new music is dissolved. Absolute music was the dominant idea of art music in the 20th century because it was almost impossible for composers to compose with any other aesthetic material than sounds produced by acoustic instruments. Relational music is emerging and is increasingly shaping art music because today all composers can use the corresponding computer programs equally. Relational music, like 19th century program music, is a counter-concept or the opposite term to the idea of absolute music. In contrast to program music, however, relational music refers to not only to a narrative in program music, but to any extra musical material that becomes an essential part of the composition. The so-called extra musical material has so far been excluded from the notion of art music, which defines itself as absolute music. In contrast, the extra musical material is included in the notion of art music, which defines itself as relational music. One could, of course, object that the idea of relational music is not really new. Composers like Pierre Schaeffer, Maurizio Kagel, or Helmut Lachenmann have long since composed with everyday sound, theatrical movements, and language. However, the extra musical material was once again subjected by these composers to the logic of absolute music. The everyday noise recorded on tape are processed by Schaeffer until they sound completely abstract and all external references are erased. In Kagel's compositions, human movements follow the sound and rhythm of the music. And in Lachenmann's work, human speech is broken down into sound material that speech loses its communicative function. The real criterion for distinguishing between absolute and relational music is the criterion of alterity. That is, whether or not musical material retains its otherness. Carola Baukol's OIC from 2015-16 for clarinet, piano, cello, and two players for rubber balls is a fine example of relational music. The main props in this piece are two rubber balls on the knees of the players, as you can see here in the sketch. These balls go through a series of metamorphoses in the piece. First, the balls appear as mere objects. You can see the balls on stage. Secondly, they are used as drums. Thirdly, the two balls transform into two eyes. Fourth, the two eyes begin to perceive the surroundings. That is, they turn in the direction of the sound coming from the stage. The fifth metamorphosis is reached when the sounds come from everywhere and you see a kind of hearing with open eyes. And sixth, in the final stage, the eyes move to the rhythm of the music. Here, a synchronization of hearing and seeing occurs. In this last stage, relational music transforms back into absolute music, insofar as the eyeballs are again subjected to the rhythm or logic of the music. In Barcode's piece, absolute music becomes a borderline case of relational music. All in all I see is a very vivid self-reflexive piece. The whole stage appears to the audience as a face with two eyes, and the piano as a nose, observing how the music is created on stage. The stage gains the ability to see. This is exactly what the title wants to say. Oh, I see. Next to relational music, conceptual music is a second predetermined breaking point in the historical notion of music. Strictly speaking, as I explained in the second lecture, it is digital conceptual music that has led to this transgression of the boundaries of the traditional notion of new music. It is true that decades ago, there were already pieces like John Cage 433 or Fluxus pieces like George Crest's Shaking Hands or Stockhausen's text scores like Set Sail for the Sun. However, at the time they were created, these pieces were not composed as conceptual music, they were not named as conceptual music, and they were not received as conceptual music. Today, we can label these works as historical conceptual music, but they had no implications for the internal process of differentiation of the notion of art music. Digital conceptual music was provocative for the new music scene and caused some controversy because this kind of music, or let's say anti-music, was most in conflict with the hegemonic paradigm of the new music scene. Conceptual music negates both the idea of absolute music and the idea of material progress. In most cases, conceptual music is also anesthetic, that is, It is something like ready-made music in the style of the genre. Here you can see an entire issue of the Neue Zeitschrift for Musik, the new journal for music, with text by Johannes Kreitl, myself, and others. In my contribution, I introduced the distinction between digital and historical conceptual music, and also developed the argument why there has been a systematic exclusion of historical conceptual music from the new music scene in the 20th century. Until a decade ago, conceptual music lacked an adequate storage and distribution medium. That is the main argument. And this adequate storage and distribution medium became only available with video platforms like YouTube. Here is an example where you can see the difference between historical and digital conceptual music in one piece. Johannes Kreitl's Kinect 3D Sensor Studies #2 also includes a reenactment of a Fluxus piece, the Fluxus piece by Robert Bozzi from 1966. Bozzi's piece was a radical concept piece, created solely in the imagination of the reader and could not be performed until now, if only because of the health risk involved. In 2011, Kreitl came up with the idea of actually performing the piece with the help of trigger lines, thus transferring a prime example of historical conceptual music into a genre of digital conceptual music. The plastic bucket as a substitute for a helmet makes it clear that Bozzi's concept piece is not simply realized, but that Kreitl makes an ironic comment on historical conceptual music. The best known characteristic of postmodern art is the deliberate crossing of boundaries from high culture to popular culture. In comparison with postmodernism in the visual arts, this border crossing in new music was only half-hearted, so that no real musical postmodernism has developed in the 20th century. As examples of postmodernism in art music, musicologists usually cite pieces like the First Symphony of Alfred Schnittke, the Third String Quartet Im Innersten by Wolfgang Riem, or the ensemble piece for four voices, Die Style by Louis Andriessen. All these pieces break with an avant-garde taboo in one way or another, partly by moving back into the tonal system. But this half-hearted postmodern new music does not really bridge the gap to popular music and popular culture, but rather quote classical music or highbrow jazz. Postmodern art works with kitsch, pornography, and with trivial genres, which cannot be found in the new music of the 20th century with its strong affinity to classical music. If you want to develop a theory of musical postmodernism, a good test question is, who is the Jeff Koons and the Andy Warhol of new music? In 2016, Moritz Eggert's piece Muzak was premiered with the Bavarian Radio Symphony Orchestra, a piece which is comparable to the postmodernism of Koons and Warhol. In this essay, titled Muzak, or How Postmodernism Has Afflicted New Music, I presented a corresponding theory of musical postmodernism. The essay has two parts. The first part is the theoretical part in which I present a notion of postmodern art, postmodern art has three criteria. It is popular, ironic, and postmodern art has a double coding. In the second part, I discuss Moritz Eggert's piece, which is a collage of popular music. So you can hear Elvis, Louis Armstrong, Lou Reed, Tom Waits, David Bowie, John Lennon, and much, much more.
And now I see you, and you can really see me. And now I can see you, and you can really see me. And now I can really see you, and you can really see me. And now I can see you, and you can really see me. And now I see you, and you can really see me. And now I can really see you, and you can really see me. And now I can see you. And you can really see me, and now I see. Just one more time, baby, 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 baby. Just one more time, baby, 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 baby. Just one more time. Hey, all you people all around the city, Saturday night is a-coming and the kids are all right. And the kids are all right. Hey everybody, listen to the music. Saturday night is a-coming and the kids are all right. And the kids are all right. Oh baby, I can't stop loving you. Baby, I can't stop loving you. Will you smile when I tell you?
Muzak is not only a half-hearted but a real example of musical postmodernism that uncompromisingly crosses the border to popular music, as you could hear. Eggert's piece fulfills all three postmodernism criteria at the same time. And it's important to say that this performance took place at the New Music Festival. First, the piece is popular. It is a well-composed, trivial pop music potpourri with many love songs. Secondly, the piece is very ironic. The new music composer, Moritz Eggert himself, is on stage and sings with the large symphony orchestra like a pop music star, as you could see on the photo. And thirdly, the piece is double-coded. The pop music audience can enjoy the sound and the performance on the one hand, and on the other hand, the insider of art music can perceive the piece as a contribution to the discourse on musical postmodernism. In recent years, the forced borderline between new music and classical music has also become porous, but not because of the postmodern quotation. This borderline is now being bridged with the help of digital technology. Virtual orchestras such as East West or the Vienna Symphonic Library have been around for over 10 years. In art music, however, virtual instruments are not only used to record scores, but they are becoming a new medium of composition. Because of this functional change of virtual instruments, I have suggested to name this kind of art music differently and to speak of ePlayer music here. An example of such an ePlayer composition would be Thomas Hummel's ensemble piece Zinaida Kabaljenka for 6 instruments and ePlayer orchestra from 2014. Thomas Hummel is the creator of Contemporary, a virtual orchestra with extended playing techniques, which also includes a Contemporary ePlayer. The piece contains sound surfaces as they can be heard, for instance, in Ligetis atmospheres, for which you would normally need 50 musicians to create them. But here they have been composed with ePlayers. There is even a passage for 30 ePlayer bass trumpets with bassoon mouthpieces that could never be recorded with a real orchestra. These possibilities of composing with virtual instruments have brought about a strong democratization of new music, inasmuch as now, in principle, every composer can write a large orchestral piece and perform it like Thomas Hummel with a small ensemble. This is the situation of art music today. The 4 constitutive boundaries of new music have been crossed and perforated and thus do not work as boundaries anymore. In 2016, Johannes Kreitl presented exactly this thesis in an essay entitled The Dissolved Notion of Music. However, Kreitl understands the thesis of the dissolved notion of music not only as an observation, but also as a normative statement. Musical conceptualism would become the new paradigm of art music insofar as art music loses its media specificity. In the final analysis, Kreitl's conception of the dissolved notion of music would result in a decoupling of art music from classical music and music academies. Ultimately, art music would have to emigrate to art academies that specialize in conceptual art. But the thesis of the dissolved notion of music is only half the story. What actually develops in art music is a reflexive notion of music that does not simply renounce boundaries and demarcations to other arts and other genres, but defines the constitutive boundaries of art music in a different way. The boundaries of art music are not anymore ontological boundaries based on perception, but rather boundaries of communication in the art music discourse and in the art music system. Here, the distinction between absolute and relational, aesthetic, anesthetic, elitist, popular, tonal, and atonal understood as boundaries that can be crossed. But insofar as these boundary crossings are reflected as conscious actions in art music, a new border between art music and that which does not belong to it formed. Neither in popular music, nor in the live world, nor in the other arts, and certainly not in classical music, does this kind of reflective crossing of boundaries occur. One could also say that art music remains the special genre that reflects its own history of differentiation. Its real distinguishing feature from all other musical practices is, at least, a preference for complexity in perception and in thought. Examples play a decisive role in this model. One knows one's way around a field of knowledge or experience precisely when one knows the extremes in this field. In this respect, one must also know the outstanding examples that demonstrate the nature of a reflexive notion of music. Carola Barkol's OIC, Johannes Kreidler's reenactment of Robert Botzi's Choice No. 3, Moritz Eggert's Muzak, and Thomas Hummel's Zinaida Kovalenka show how extremely different the works are that belong to this self-reflexive notion of music. If one knows the extremes, one can also ask oneself the question, which pieces are at the center of this reflexive notion of music? In other words, which compositions use all these artistic freedoms of a reflexive notion of music in a particularly intelligent way? And here my choice would be Trond Reinholdsen's Piano Concerto, Theory of the Subject. Reinholdsen's Piano Concerto is not characterized by any new transgression, but it is the piece that brings together all the historical transgressions of new music in one work. The piece is relational music in the sense that film screenings, text projections, and theater performances are also shown during the piano concert. But it is also conceptual music insofar as it entails a prelude of conceptual music. Furthermore, Reinholdsen's piece contains radical postmodern passages. For example, one can hear hyper-affirmative pop music with the great text line, "We are sitting in the postmodern marsh." And the piano concerto again and again crosses the border between classical and new music. For instance, one hears once classical music in the style of Richard Strauss, and then complexist music in the style of Brian Ferneyhough. This piano concerto is thus a prime example of reflexive art music. All four constitutive distinctions of art music, tonal, atonal, absolute, relational, aesthetic, anesthetic, elite, popular, are articulated as differences in this piece. During the concert, the pianist becomes a tragic heroine as she is replaced by a self-playing piano. She no longer plays on stage but reads French philosophy, a great symbol both of the end of material progress and the turn to conceptual music. I would like to show you a short clip from the film that was shown during the concert. You will first see how the pianist, that's the pianist on the picture, plays through the entire repertoire of modern piano music from Debussy to Stockhausen to come up with new ideas. Then she takes a cab to the composer's studio where three strange creatures, I call them trolls, live. After that, the mathematical sign for the empty set appears, which is in this context means that all assumptions and values of new music should be suspended. The piano concert makes a clear sweep and seeks a radical new beginning. The pianist searches together with three trolls for a way out of the so-called postmodern march. The film scenes are pure ePlayer compositions in which all vocal parts were by Trond Heinrichsen himself sung and edited on the computer.
Og så skal vi ha et liv of faith.
Kom igjen med liv of faith gjennom Må vi gå gjennom myra? Alle må gå gjennom myra. Gå gjennom myra. Vi skal ha et liv of faith.
Liv of faith. Ja.
Let us return to our original model. The thesis was that digitization is triggering a paradigm shift where the two complementary questions, what is music and what is good music, are redefined. On the one hand, the idea of absolute music, which new music followed throughout the 20th century, is replaced by a reflexive notion of music. So the answer to the question, what is art music, can be given as art music is reflexive music. But what about the normative aspect of art music today? To what extent one can even say that art music is well-made, great, or innovative? We had seen that newness in new music can no longer be generated by material progress and by crossing borders. This does not mean, however, that one has to give up the whole idea of art music to produce something genuinely new. Instead, it's more about redefining the idea of being new. If newness cannot be generated either with musical material or through a further transgression of the notion of music, it can still be created with new aesthetic contents. This brings me to the end of my presentation. The digital revolution works as a catalyst for a paradigm shift in new music. One can observe the disintegration of the historical paradigm of new music, which was based on the idea of absolute music and material progress. Of course, one will have to wait and see which new self-description of art music will actually prevail in a digital music culture, but I see the greatest innovation potential in this reflexive art music that operates in a content aesthetic way.